I'm Chris Corson, fortunate to be a Greenbelt artist in residence. I'm in my studio at the Greenbelt Community Center in what was originally a classroom when this building opened as Greenbelt's first elementary school in 1937. I work in clay, mostly doing the human form, like this figure, which I call Dreamer. I build my figures by hand using simple tools. I like to build fairly large, often as large as I can fit into the kiln for the first firing. Why focus on the human form? The body contains and expresses us. I believe that how we sit, stand, move, are all affected by our inner emotional landscape and life experience. Bodies, I think, store these things in our muscles and tissues and reveal them in posture and gesture. So when I sculpt the body, I believe that I am exploring the human condition at its most direct and basic. Artistically, I also enjoy exploring interesting postures, like this one. I finished Dreamer in a wood kiln at very high temperature, which produced this beautiful red and these deposits of wood ash. Sometimes people ask, how do you get from a bag of wet clay to a finished form like this? If you have about 8 minutes, stay tuned, and I will show you step by step how I made Dreamer. Keep this pose in mind as we go through the steps. The figure is seated with both legs to the right. The right thigh is raised so that the left leg can pass beneath it. This tilts the torso to the left, and the right arm crossing in front creates some twist. The left arm is back. I make my larger figures on a diagram of the pose, which you can see under the plastic. The circle around the diagram is a bit smaller than the inside of the kiln. As long as I build the figure within the circle, I know that it will fit into the kiln for firing. I started by making the feet. This is the right foot sitting on the diagram. You can see the pencil outline of where the left foot will go. The ankle is hollow because solid clay will crack or even explode when fired. All of Dreamer is built hollow. The left foot in place. But at this point, I took both feet off the diagram and wrapped them in plastic to prevent the clay from drying out as I worked on the rest of the figure. This will be the back of the figure's seat. I make my figures out of flat slabs and strips of clay, wrapping and shaping them to make my forms. This image shows the other side and how I cut and folded the flat slab into 3 dimensions. This image shows the start of manipulating the clay for more realism. This process will continue throughout construction. I built the torso upward by adding bands of new clay. This first new band became the lower back and in front, the abdomen. The wooden support kept the clay from collapsing down. As the clay starts to dry, it stiffens and can support its own weight and then the weight of newer clay added above. The raised right thigh is an important part of this pose, so I propped it up to start it drying properly. The left thigh started as a slab made into a tube so that the figure stays hollow. The dots mark where I needed to cut the new clay to fit onto the old. Here is the left thigh cut and then joined. I made a narrower tube of clay for the lower leg and brought out the left foot to test fit it. Here's the foot attached. The lower leg is longer than it needed to be, again for test fitting. Cut to length. The left thigh cut to receive it. and joined. I leave the knees open so that I can continue to shape the upper and lower legs from the inside as well as the outside using a French baking pin. This picture also shows the start of the right thigh as another tube of clay, joined and resting on the top of the left leg. This is the other foot back in place on the diagram, so I can make sure of being on the right track. I'll actually attach it a bit later. This is a piece of clay slab that I cut and shaped to become the lower abdomen. Added on the inside and smoothed and shaped on the outside. New clay to continue the torso upward. It flares a bit because the rib cage is a bit wider than the midriff. Smoothed in. And more new clay added, bringing the figure up to the level of the shoulder blades. This tube will become the right upper arm. Pinned to test fit it, cut for joining, and joined. Left upper arm, pinned, and joined. I made the right hand, mostly hollow, to rest on the left leg as the right forearm reaches across the abdomen, and I've been continuing to add more definition to the figure. Here is the left hand, but before attaching either hand, I wanted to get a better feel for the shoulders. So I added much more clay than I needed so I could shape it down. Here the new clay is blended in. Here I cut 8 or so darts out of the new clay to bring it together and define the top of the shoulders. The green cloth, which I kept damp, helped keep the legs from drying too much as I worked on the upper figure. Finally ready for the right forearm, which is another tube. Here the hand is joined and the forearm is cut to a test fit. This shows it in place. I pressed in the clay of the lower abdomen as a real forearm in that position would do. Time for the left forearm, reaching back. I needed to prop it in place while it dried enough to hold its position when I attached the hand. At this point, the body is largely done, except for the continuing process of refining shape. The head also started as a tube, eye sockets, and the start of the nose. The cut at the tube's bottom allowed the clay to be brought together to form the chin and neck. Cutting darts out of the top of the tube helped form the top of the head. I also added some clay for the mouth and the underlying oval of muscles, which project out a bit from the plane of the face. Refining facial features. The top of the head is still open, so I can get my hand in to work the clay from the inside as well as the outside. Eyeballs are much bigger than what we see between the lids. I started laying in the lids, but then decided that I wanted the eyes to be closed. I didn't know at that time that I would end up calling the figure Dreamer, but I think my intuition was working. Closing the head and attaching it to the body. The tilt of the head is very important to the gesture and mood of the piece. Ears came last, which I sculpted from somewhat thicker, small slabs, and then attached to depressions carved into the head. Ear placement can be tricky. They attach more toward the back of the head than the front, and slant a bit backward. Placement must be symmetrical. Clay must be completely dry before it can go into the kiln, but a complicated figure like this must dry slowly. Clay shrinks as it dries, and that must happen evenly. So I alternated between exposing the clay and keeping it covered over the course of several weeks. Here is the figure as I opened the kiln after the first firing. I'm happy to say that it went perfectly. The first firing turns my clay body pink. However, I wanted something much more dramatic. The very high temperature of a wood kiln turns my clay dark red. The lighter colors are deposits of wood ash. So, now you know how this was done. You can see Dreamer and my other work in person in my studio when it is open on Sunday, May the 7th from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock, which is the Community Center's spring open studio tour. You can also contact me directly and we can arrange a time for a studio visit. And I teach sculpture in the Community Center Ceramics program in case you ever want to try your own hand at three-dimensional ceramic work, whether it's figurative or anything else. I hope to see you around.